You are watching programming from the East-West Center in Washington, D.C.
Welcome and thank you for joining us for today's webinar from KL with Love, North Korea-Malaysia Relations, featuring Dr. Chiew-Ping Hoo of the National University of Malaysia. I'm Keith Luce, Executive Director of the National Committee on North Korea. NCNK works to promote principled engagement between the United States and North Korea. Today's webinar is the second installment of our North Korea in the World webinar series, co-hosted by NCNK and the East-West Center in Washington. The first episode in this series, Beyond the Hermit Kingdom, North Korea and the Post-Colonial World, featuring Dr. Benjamin Young, is now available on NCNK's YouTube channel. You can find details of upcoming webinars in this series on our website or through the East-West Center's website as well. I also encourage folks in the audience to check out the NCNK East-West Center North Korea in the World.org website, where we've collected a broad range of information related to North Korea's foreign trade, diplomatic relations, and more. We're very pleased today to have Dr. Chiew-Ping Hoo with us to talk about North Korea's relationship with Malaysia and where that relationship may now stand. Dr. Hoo is Senior Lecturer in Strategic Studies and International Relations Program at the National University of Malaysia and is currently leading a Korea-funded program on Southeast North Korea relations, Southeast Asia, North Korea relations. I'm particularly excited about today's program. My introduction to Malaysia occurred in 1989 as part of a staff delegation from the House and the Senate. Dr. Bertie Talala, Malaysia's former ambassador to the United States, was quite an encouragement to me as an American to look to Southeast Asia and the prospects for improved relations, commercial, political, and so on, between those two parts of the world. So I've made 30 plus trips to Malaysia in the public and private sectors. And I was fascinated initially by the relationship, Malaysia, North Korea, the non-aligned movement, Prime Minister Mahathir. But then over time, that developed into quite a curiosity about the complexity of the North Korea-Malaysia relationship, which we will hear more today about from Dr. Hoo. But I'd like to now turn over to Ross Tokola, who is the Executive Director at the East-West Center in Washington, where he gives advice and support to the Director on ongoing near-term and long-term strategic projects and programs. Ross is also responsible for the Congressional Staff Program on Asia and for North Korea in the World. Previously, he was a program officer at the ASEAN Institute for Policy Studies during his 5 years in Seoul, and he worked for the US embassies, both in the Republic of Korea and in the United Kingdom. In addition to studying the Korean language at Sogang University in Seoul, he holds a BA and MA in philosophy from Heythrop College, the University of London, and a master's in philosophy and international relations from the Department of Politics and International Studies at the University of Cambridge. Before we get started, let me encourage members of the audience to submit questions using the Q&A function in Zoom. And with that, I now turn it over to Ross.
Well, Keith, thank you. It's a pleasure for us at the East-West Center to be partnering with you and with NCNK on this project and this webinar series. And thank you to everyone who's tuned in today for what's sure to be a fascinating discussion. And a special thanks to Dr. Chiew-Ping Hoo for joining us today as our presenter. To share a bit more of her background, in addition to her position as a senior lecturer at the University of Malaysia, she is also concurrently a co-founder and co-convener of the East Asia and International Relations Caucus. She was a 2017 Shangri-La Dialogue Southeast Asian Young Leaders Program Associate Research Fellow at the International Institute for Strategic Studies, Asia. And her main research interests include South Korean foreign policy, North Korean provocations, IR theory, and Korea-Southeast Asia relations. She is currently leading a Korea Foundation-funded project on Southeast Asia-North Korea relations, in which she's examining security economic linkages and strategic uncertainties of North Korean security challenges in the region. With that, Dr. Hoo, thank you so much for joining us. Please, over to you.
I would like to record my thanks to NCNK and also East West Center, Washington, D.C. for hosting me for this talk. So I attended the previous talk by Dr. Ben Yang about North Korea's place in the post-colonial world. And I couldn't agree more with what he has shared during the previous webinar, of which what is so appealing to the post-colonial third world countries of North Korea. So one thing that stands out in particular is that they want to boost their international prestiges with the what is the very popular language right now, the like-minded countries. So in my archival research on the Malaysia-North Korea relations, I found that the mention of the similarities between the country of struggle with colonialism and anti-imperialist ideological similarities has been emphasized again and again. And also, they also find similarities in their joint spirit, trying to build economic advancement and also for peace. So the rationale for engaging the post-colonial countries anti-imperialism stands out as the one of the key reason and rationale for both countries to pursue that together. So Malaysia-North Korea relations has been established after the active pursuit by North Korean in overseas ambassadorial presence. So they have been reaching out to Malaysian ambassador in diplomatic missions in Australia, in Singapore, in Yugoslavia, and Paris. So finally, it was in Indonesia through Jakarta that they finally decided to jointly establish bilateral relations. And prior to that beginning of the relations, Malaysian policymakers, including the Prime Minister, debated whether we should establish these relations with North Korea. So from the one of the archive memo that was believed to be written by the Ministry of Foreign Affairs of Malaysia's officials, so we found that it is best to adopt the hedging position between the two Koreas. So when South Korea was made known of North Korea's outreach to Malaysia, so the representative of South Korea in Malaysia frequent the offices in Ministry of Foreign Affairs in Kuala Lumpur and trying to convince us that was not a very good idea to do so. So after balancing several rationales and views, Tun Abdul Razak, together with his officials, come to the conclusion that on the heels of recognizing many other communist ideology countries, the first being the Soviet Union, second is Germany, third, North Vietnam. So we established diplomatic relations with those communist countries in that order. And North Korea is the fourth communist country that Malaysia established diplomatic relations with, right before we established diplomatic relations with China. So this development is not without connection with the domestic political development. Our founding father, the first Prime Minister of Malaysia, Tunku Abdul Rahman, is actually a very pro-West leader. So we achieved our independence through peaceful means by negotiation with London. So we actually maintain very good relations with our former colonial master. So what caused the change in this foreign policy orientation is the fact that the Sino-Soviet split in the 60s and also led on by the détente reached between the United States and China. So taking into account those international development and also domestically, we were facing a kind of socio-economic imbalance that led to ethnic conflicts in the country. So we start to develop the direction in which we will adopt a much more balanced approach established relations, friendly relations with all countries that wanted to establish trade relations. One of the very first delegation that comes to Malaysia from North Korea is a trade delegation received by Malaysian Investment Corporation Agency. And unbeknownst to many people, one of the long-standing ties between Malaysia and North Korea was actually through sport diplomacy. So we begin with ping pong or the table tennis matches, friendly matches between the two countries. And in the modern times, after the 2000, that includes also the sport diplomacy involving in soccer games, and that even occurred even after the assassination of Kim Jong Nam in 2017, which became quite a issue diplomatically. So Tun Abdul Razak, our second prime minister, set forth the equidistant diplomacy between North and South Korea, and that is how we have been pursuing the bilateral relations in that manner. So the project about Southeast Asia and North Korea relations, we understand that North Korea actually launched Charm Offensive around the same time with the rest of the Southeast Asian country, and that includes Singapore as well. So we often find very close coordination, coordinated steps by North Korea involving Malaysia, Indonesia, and sometimes Cambodia in the diplomatic outreach. So with that, I would also like to mention some of the key development after the post-Cold War era. So after Mahathir was no longer the prime minister, so I think there is a lot of questions about this later. So Mahathir Mohamad, our fourth prime minister, and for the second time holding the position as prime minister of Malaysia in 2018 until 2020, was a big supporter of North Korea. So many of North Korea's international memberships in United Nations agencies, in the International Telecommunication Union, in World Maritime Organization, World Health Organization, all of those membership receive supports from Malaysia. So we have been maintaining that until Najib Razak, ironically, is the son of Tun Abdul Razak, who established the diplomatic ties between North Korea and Malaysia. So he actually tilted towards South Korea during his premiership. And that caused displeasures and tip off the balance between the so-called equidistant diplomacy between North and South Korea. So I would argue that that actually plays a role in as to why so many unfortunate incidents occurred under his premiership. So Malaysia actually also supports North Korea's admission and signing of Treaty of Amity and cooperation with ASEAN, and effectively become our dialogue partner. We set up the ASEAN Regional Forum, of which North Korea is still part of the member, and we hope they continue their participation in this important regional dialogue. And given what happened during the famine in the mid-90s and some disasters throughout the 2000s, Malaysia increased their presence in North Korea through our embassy in Pyongyang. And there were 5 out of 10 ASEAN countries that established their embassies in Pyongyang. And they colloquially call themselves ASEAN Committee in Pyongyang. And Malaysia has helped establish humanitarian assistance presence through Malaysian Medical Relief Agency called MERCY. We provide aid during train disaster, floodings, and many more. We also have renewed agreement with North Korea, including aviation agreement that allow direct flight between Kuala Lumpur and Pyongyang. We also set up the DPRK Tourism Board, which represents Southeast Asia and South Asia, so which cover also India, Pakistan, and many other countries within these 2 sub-regions. So Mahathir in particular has established a personal friendship with Kim Il-sung, and that relations has transformed under the Kim Jong Il era that become one of heavily dependent on the business ties. So this is where, when inherited by the next Prime Minister, Tun Abdullah Razak, it was found that some of the incidents of accidental proliferation occurred, where the dual-use technology and equipment become part of the highlight on the nuclear proliferation agenda. So Malaysia, in response, set up the Strategic Trade Act to be able to detect more of those movement and also import-export of sensitive equipments, and other countries like Singapore and the rest of the world also follow. So what is so important about Kim Jong Nam's assassination is that despite it was Najib's own doing that caused the imbalance in the two sets of relations with two Koreas. However, he made the choice not to sever ties with DPRK officially at that time. And Malaysian government received heavy criticism as a result of the management of the assassination due to the reduced knowledge and recognition of the role of North Korea in Malaysia. So after the Mahathir's generation of officials retiring from the government, there is no next generation government officials who are familiar with North Korea and the long-standing ties that was cultivated under the Mahathir regime. So we have officially, Malaysia pledged compliance with United Nations resolutions. Many companies have difficulty receiving funding or conducting financial transactions. We also have to oblige with the ship inspection after the assassination. So, you can say that Tun Razak's legacy diminished under his son regime. And the Kim Jong Nam incident did hurt Malaysia's reputation as a reliable partner in holding North Korea accountable. So since then, we have many tumultuous Malaysian domestic political development. So despite Mahathir's best intention during his second premiership to revive the relations with North Korea, including reopen Malaysian embassy in Pyongyang in 2019, however, it was faced with another untimely incident of global pandemic outbreak. So the plan was delayed, and suddenly a government hijack happened, of which currently our new Prime Minister, Muhyiddin, doesn't have any personal ties with the North Korean regime. And therefore, when we agreed to hand over the extradition request from the United States of North Korean national Moon Chol-myung, residing in Malaysia, on the accusation of money laundering charges. So he was being handed over to the United States a few months ago, and North Korea decided to break off the ties with Malaysia. So that's all I would like to share with you so far, and I welcome any questions and comments. Thank you so much.
Dr. Hoo, thank you so much for such a rich presentation full of discussion topics. As a reminder to our listeners and to our guests, please do ask your questions in the Q&A. But to start us off with the discussion phase of this webinar, I'd like to ask you, in preparation for this webinar, I went, as I often do, to the North Korea in the World website. And there I saw that there have been a whole host of aspects of Malaysia-North Korea relations that are people-to-people, economic, commercial. I didn't know that there was that 60 North Korean artists from the Moonsadeh Art Studio in Pyongyang have been commissioned to do artworks that are showcased in the Paddy Museum in Malaysia. And you've spoken of sports and tourism, and many people-to-people ties. Over the years, like up until 2017, when relations began to break down, did those ties translate into positive public opinion in Malaysia towards North Korea?
I think the public are very much influenced by what has been reported in the media. So Malaysian media themselves doesn't know much about North Korea, to be honest. But in the 70s and 80s, North Korea often put up a lot of advertisement in our national media, newspapers. Malaysia is a multi-ethnic society, so those advertisements were put up in the Malay newspaper in Chinese language newspaper, and I can't understand Tamil, but I suspect they appear there too. So some of the tourist agencies based in Malaysia run two operations in North Korea, and they often advertise among the Chinese ethnic community, and that actually piqued a lot of interest because the tour packages usually cover both China and North Korea. So a lot of people actually sign up for that tour packages. Likewise in Singapore as well. So I know a lot of Singaporean and Malaysians who have personally visited North Korea due to those offers. So in regards to, I think among the Malays, it is lesser known because of the lack of heightened awareness that was being promoted under Mahathir's time, no longer seen, especially in recent decade. So I think that recognition has been reduced and become very low profile until the assassination incident occurred.
Hmm. Oh, it's fascinating. Ask another question. In your Asia Pacific Bulletin article in 2019, From Neutrality to Pragmatism in Malaysia-North Korea Relations, you wrote, like, this is 2 years after the Kim Jong Nam's assassination and 2 years before the High Court's decision this March of this year, regarding the extradition of the North Korean to the United States. You wrote, Malaysia does not want to be the only country in Southeast Asia that severed or lost ties with North Korea. The significance and utility of such a position is that it may offer the two Koreas a channel of communication through a third country, while also remaining part of the ASEAN consensus on dealing with North Korea, mitigating risks via diplomacy and engagement. So several aspects in there that I'd like to engage with, but I will just ask about the ASEAN consensus, and to what extent has that helped mitigate risk via diplomacy and engagement? And please, at the same time, I'd be curious to hear whether, to some extent, Malaysia seems to have been better off in its relations with North Korea than its Southeast Asian neighbors. But in the last 4 years, it is worse off than its neighbors. So if you could speak to that for a few moments, that'd be terrific.
Oh yeah, thanks so much for this question. So it seems like my voice trying to convince Malaysian government of the importance of maintaining the ties doesn't convince them at all. So I think in terms of the discussion about Korean Peninsula, back in the day, so like say in the 70s and 80s, Korean peace process was actively discussed, and Malaysia and Singapore both become the hosts of the secret negotiations between United States and North Korea, and also between South Korea and North Korea whenever they attended the ASEAN Regional Forum hosted by Kuala Lumpur or Singapore. So there was significance in playing host to those international negotiation process, and Malaysia often prides itself to be the middle person or facilitator of any form of peace process, and we have done so in many other instances, not only in Southeast Asia but also in the Middle East, for instance. So it was quite puzzling to see that we no longer want to play a role in the Korean peace process. And I also believe that it is partially part of the political agenda by the current prime minister. So it was like the time of transitioning from Clinton administration to Bush administration. So Bush government allegedly has a policy called ABC, anything but Clinton. So everything that was promoted by the previous leader would be denied by the next leader, especially if they are rivals. So I believe that was the case. And unfortunately, because what I witnessed during the Kim Jong Nam assassination is that we did convene like the phone calls going around the ASEAN member states. So what should we do now? Should we come up with a public statements and things like that? So not maintaining a presence in Pyongyang, and also Malaysia is kind of losing out on its position to contribute any kind of voice on the Korean Peninsula issues, unfortunately.
Thank you very much. I'll now turn to some questions that are already coming in from our audience. First, from Eunjung Cho. She also notes Malaysia-North Korea relations went downhill after the assassination of Kim Jong Nam. The biggest blow came when Malaysia extradited Moon Chul-myong to the US for illicit activities. At the time, why did Malaysia decide to extradite Moon? What is Malaysian reaction to North Korea's decision to sever ties with Kuala Lumpur?
So I believe after the Kim Jong Nam assassination, it really affect many of the contemporary policymakers and government officials in Malaysia that North Korea is no longer reliable, and that they would rather comply with the international law, and as the request made by the United States might have proven some of those evidence to the Malaysian government for their eyes, and they believe that he is guilty as charged, and therefore agree to the extradition. So I think Malaysia doesn't mind anymore after that North Korea decided to sever ties with Malaysia, because too much to lose compared to what to be gained to maintaining this rather unique diplomatic ties in the current political climate.
Thank you. And given the breakdown in relations, what kind of North Korean presence is in Malaysia right now? I've had a few questions so far of, are there businessmen there? Are there citizens there that are stuck after the ties broke down? Could you speak to, over time even, what the North Korean presence like has been in Malaysia and the Malaysian presence in North Korea?
Indeed. So Moon Chol-myung actually runs a import-export company in Singapore and operating from Kuala Lumpur. So I believe he might have frequent visits to Singapore before the pandemic. So it was on that basis that his extradition request was made. And Ri Jong-chul, the one that was implicated in the assassination of Kim Jong Nam, he was also a businessman, and there were many trade deals and business transactions occurred between him and also with Pyongyang. So even back in the Bush administration years, there were charges against Malaysian local banking system that we actually helped transfer funding for the arms sales between Myanmar and also North Korea. So we actually we frozen the fund and handed over to the United States Treasury. So there is a strong implication as to the accumulation of those deeds that heavily prove the heavy business presence in Malaysia. So as a result of Moon Chol-myung's extradition, the rest of the North Korean citizens who has been establishing their presence, living here for decades, were still around, because some of them actually acquired the permanent resident status. So, and under the pandemic, it is impossible for them to move around. They couldn't return to North Korea, for instance. So I believe they are laying a very low profile as of now. And many of their children actually attending international schools and even university and colleges in Malaysia. So, and I have come across with some of the South Koreans who actually in the same class with those North Korean children. So I think life has to go on as it is, and there is nothing that we can do about that. And we hope that their presence in Malaysia will no longer be one of that sabotaging further and copycat further of Malaysia's position.
Oh, it's really interesting. Thank you. I have another question from, let me see, Roy Anthony Rogers. He says, good evening and good morning to the West and East West Center. Thank you, Dr. Ho, for the wonderful presentation. I have two questions. One, do you think any possibilities of reconciliation between Malaysia and North Korea in future? I have a few other questions in the chat about what's going to happen next. Would it be through trade? So what would the future look like? And second, he says, I am very interested, as you mentioned, about the archival research on Malaysia and North Korea, as I used to do archival research myself. Can you elaborate on the research? Was it easy to obtain contemporary files? So please, Dr. Hu.
Okay, thank you. So I also see in the question and answer, someone asked about what is the future and prospect of rekindle diplomatic ties.
Yeah.
Well, we actually had several outstanding agreements to be implemented. So within the week of Kim Jong Nam assassination, so it was really a badly timed incident, we were actually renewing the cultural agreement between Malaysia and DPRK. So it was renewed since every 5 years since 2002. So the area of cooperation, including museum, archival, exchange visit between the dance troupe. So when I went to Singapore for archival research, I also found the account that Singapore art troops, they enjoy whenever they had performance in Pyongyang, and they praise of the city for its cleanliness and all that. So for Malaysia, I'm really not sure, but we used to have a very strong science and technology exchanges, which is usually the portfolio held by the first secretary at the DPRK embassy. And in my university, the National University of Malaysia, we had a full collection of Kim Il-sung's speech and probably some of his memoir and things like that. So that was definitely happening during the time of very good bilateral relations between Malaysia and North Korea. And our very own premier national think tank institute called the Institute of Strategic and International Studies, ISIS Malaysia. So we actually had Malaysia DPRK roundtable discussion back in the 80s. So the meeting would be taking place in Kuala Lumpur and Pyongyang 1 year after another. So yeah, the think tank exchanges has been maintained, and it was evident right before the assassination. So they visit the think tank and have discussion about Korean Peninsula, geopolitics and all that. I personally was representing Malaysia in one of the roundtable on Korean Peninsula on the request of DPRK's Institute for Peace and Disarmament Institute, so which was held in Yangon. So I think all of these exchanges are very meaningful, and this exchange that took place in Yangon was actually particularly interesting because it occurred few months before the Hanoi summit between Trump and Kim Jong Un in Hanoi. So many of the things that have been discussed during that roundtable come as no surprise. Like the demand for partial sanctions relief and all that. So it's a shame that North Korea has been cut out of the track 2 exchanges with Southeast Asian countries. I hope that actually can be rekindled on the online format if possible, because there was some good news from our neighboring NGO, Chosen Exchange in Singapore, that has successfully conducted online lecture with citizens from Pyongyang. So we look forward to the Southeast Asia North Korea exchange format to be moved online. So if that is possible.
That sounds great.
If I may address Dr. Roy's second question, I think.
Please, of course.
So the archival research used to be quite open, so I managed to cover most of them before the assassination. I think that's the reason why I managed to get hold of so many materials. So you can find the file Malaysia-North Korea relations volume. I don't know where is the volume 1, but it actually started with volume 15. So that was actually the first volume on the bilateral relations. And the volumes go on to 20 something and cover pretty much the details of the governmental exchange between DPRK and Malaysia. We also often keep tab with the Malaysian missions overseas on everything that they know about North Korea. So for instance, there is also a very detailed record about the non-aligned movement exchanges. Hwang Chang-yok, one of the defectors from North Korea that eventually arrived in South Korea later. So before his defection, he actually led the DPRK delegation to Malaysia and talk about Juche ideology and the place of DPRK in the world, and how the geostrategic conditions surrounding North Korea was so critical, and they seek for Malaysia's support and Malaysia's opinion on it. So all of this are really crucial in understanding the nature of the relations. Unfortunately, when I make the follow-up visit, I think last year, yes. So I found that a lot of those materials were then being kept away. So they are no longer for public access, given the high profile of assassination and what follows after. So we may want to, Dr. Roy, you may want to put in a specific request with the archival, national archival officers.
Thank you very much. Another question in the Q&A is, given your deep background on North Korea, what is your reaction to the Biden policy review, and how do you assess the prospects for renewed diplomacy?
Yeah, so I think Biden policy review, we still don't know what are the details yet. So, but from the exchanges that we get to know from Moon Biden exchanges, before that, it was revealed that human rights would be one of the major agenda in US policy, North Korea policy approach. However, I do collect some signals from North Korea that it is possible to understand better what Biden administration have in for North Korea. But the recent exchanges coming out from US ROK meeting doesn't seem very, so North Korea actually contradict themselves when they said that, oh, now that there are progression or improvement in the bilateral relations between US and South Korea, so they find threatened by that. And this unilateral stance from US ROK on North Korea would actually result in more assertive and aggressive responses from North Korea, just as in the case between Lee Myung-bak and also Obama administration. So I would not be surprised if that was the case. But I also sure of the North Korean regime right now is acutely aware that high or heavy dependence on China, solely on China, may not be a very good prospect for the country way out. So I think they are still exploring what are the other channels that they can rely on.
Just to follow up, from the Malaysian government's perspective, what is the ideal policy calibration in US-North Korea relations, US-South Korea relations? What would the Malaysian government hope to see vis-a-vis the Korean Peninsula, and also vis-a-vis Malaysia and the Southeast Asian region?
I think I speak on behalf of Southeast Asian countries and also Malaysia in particular, that the maximum campaign launched by the Trump administration is particularly stressful for the governments. Like, we receive call to request for compliance with the sanctions requirement. So I think we will continue along this line. There is no other way out of this. But in general, ASEAN countries are particularly hopeful for any peace process. And this is why we lend support for Moon Jae-in government's New Southern policy, in which there was a peace pillar, and we are willing to cooperate and support for inter-Korean peace process if there is an opportunity. If not, so the if not component is what makes the reservation among the ASEAN countries and our reluctance to put Korean peace in ASEAN agenda, ASEAN summit meeting agenda. So there's that as well.
Thank you. We're coming close to the end of our time, but I'm hoping to ask just one more question about Malaysian-North Korea relations in terms of trade. Because it began with a trade delegation from North Korea, and trade relations have developed over time, and as some of our audience members have noted, trade could be the answer for improving relations again. So what does that look like over time? And I see there is a question from Michael Anderson. This will be the last one for today, I think. The Biden administration has just named US Ambassador to Indonesia, Sung Kim, as the new special envoy on North Korea. What are your views on this appointment?
Okay, so firstly, on the trade agenda, there are some Southeast Asian countries that I shall not name here. So they were quite resistant toward the maximum campaign pressure. So we believe that to maintain a kind of a sincere relations with North Korea require trust building. So in area where we think the sanctions requirement doesn't make sense and doesn't contribute to nuclear proliferation and the build-up of missile programs, we will continue trade in that area, such as textiles, import and export with North Korea. So, and that doesn't hurt. So they would just still go ahead with it until we receive maybe a warning notice from the United Nations Security Council DPRK committee. Aside from that, I think Indonesia would play a very important role. So Indonesian embassy in Pyongyang is still up and running at this moment, despite the belief that many of the overseas mission in Pyongyang has already left North Korea, go back to their home country, but Indonesia is still persistent. And I see that as a sign that they were able to procure food supplies and whatnot and forge a very good relations, close relations with North Korean regime. There is also other prospects. So as Michael Anderson mentioned, that former US ambassador to Indonesia, Song Kim, has been named as a special envoy. I'm actually doubtful of this appointment because in my understanding, he would know very well of the nature of ASEAN perspective, ASEAN view about North Korea's place in ASEAN and also between US and North Korea. ASEAN, we are an enigma ourselves that we wanted to contribute, but we are highly aware of our own limitation of to what extent we can contribute. In this sense, if the incoming South Korean administration still continue to pursue the peace approach towards North Korea, there is no doubt that ASEAN will still lend our 100% support on that policy outreach. That's all for me. Thank you.
Thanks. I will follow up to that a little bit. What has North Korea's presence at the ASEAN Regional Forum been like over the years since they joined in 2000? What have they requested? How is it? How they use the forum? How has the ASEAN Regional Forum been used to create a consensus among ASEAN members and other members of the forum to consider policy towards North Korea?
Thank you for that question. So ASEAN Regional Forum was established because United States and South Korea failed to persuade among themselves to set up a four-party talks. And that become what is known as now the ASEAN Regional Forum, talking about tackling the first nuclear crisis on the Korean Peninsula. And after that crisis was resolved in 2000, so we have the shift between Clinton and Bush administration, and ASEAN Secretary General at that time actually invited DPRK to be our dialogue partner and to join ARF. So since then, DPRK has been sending high-level representative from their foreign minister, so sitting alongside with the ASEAN Plus dialogue partners to talk about all the issues affecting Asia-Pacific countries. Unfortunately, I think it coincides with the Malaysia's support for South Korea's human rights resolution at the United Nations level. So since then, North Korea actually reduced the representative to ASEAN Regional Forum, including the track 2 ones. So they felt like they have been betrayed and ASEAN is not as reliable as they think they are. So especially since the format has been moving online. So the representative is restricted to the host country's DPRK ambassador to that country. So we hope after the pandemic is over, they can consider to return to the high-level representative of DPRK, such as the foreign minister.
Terrific, thank you so much. That brings us just about to the end of our time. So Dr. Chiew-Ping Hoo, thank you so much for being a speaker at this webinar. Thank you for taking part in this series. For our listeners, we have an upcoming webinar in this series titled Distant Comrades, ? North Korea and Vietnam, which will feature Mr. Kang Vu, who is a doctoral candidate in political science department at Boston College. The opening remarks will be given by Dr. Situ Lemay, who is the vice president of the East-West Center, of course, and director of the East-West Center in Washington. And it will be moderated by the National Committee on North Korea's Esther Im. Please do look at our websites, join us on social media to look at upcoming East-West Center events and also upcoming National Committee on North Korea events. So with that, I just want to say thank you again to everyone who listened. Thank you, Keith. Thank you, Dr. Gu. And join us for the next one. On behalf of the East-West Center and the National Committee on North Korea, thank you very much.
Thank you so much.